r/AskReddit. Children of helicopter parents. What was the worst or most embarrassing thing they put you through? Throwaway. Both parents have known, to an extent, mental disorders on top of the whole helicopter thing. Illusions of grandeur from mom, delusions, and paranoia from dad. Mom would walk me, a girl, through all the details of brutal rape she could imagine, and dazzle it up with news stories before going in public anywhere with me, or if the subject of men somehow came up. Left me traumatized for a long time, not being able to look at boys or men. Looked at porn out of curiosity or something at 10. Can't really remember due to the trauma that followed. They found my search history because I didn't know how to delete it or safely use the internet, and proceeded to interrogate me all night to see the extent to which I was defiled and who must have been molesting me. There was no one. I was homeschooled and honestly almost threw out names or thought up false events. I was beaten on and off all night till I puked. Still was interrogated as I was told to clean up the puke. I could barely move, I was shaking, and just felt like I was curling in on myself physically. They accused me of being defensive because I couldn't sit upright and normal. I would sit huddled up. I was struck with a belt from the waist to the back of my knees so bad that I had a blackish welt on my right thigh for a few days. I was told repeatedly by them that this wasn't abuse and I deserved it. They had to, because they loved me and made me hug them after everything, then sleep on the couch. I could not be trusted with a room, they said. I was treated worse than a dog for a year as grounding, and still had the event referenced as blackmail for years. I was about 18 by the time they stopped really talking about it. At 20 now, I learned that they actually think they may have gone too far and screwed me up mentally. You don't say. Happy conclusion for those who need to hear it. I turned out fine. We still talk, though I plan to cut ties. They are very emotionally dependent and fear that I will leave them. I distanced myself from them, somehow avoided drawing attention to them as the abusers. They are master manipulators, and yes, I've been to /Ray said been narcissists and got myself help by admitting myself to a mental hospital as a teen and then continuing to seek help and getting around my entire family to do so. I don't talk about this stuff anymore or really label my family as anything more than crazy. I just want to leave it in the past and define myself by what I do now as an adult. Edit. Wow, I did not expect this to gain traction. I appreciate your messages of sympathy and encouragement. About using a lawyer, I don't know. The past is dead to me. I want nothing to do with it anymore and feel like things have changed. My parents are older, I would say mellower and frailer now, still disillusioned, but it's like they're helpless. They are mentally sick people. If anything, I would want to get them into care, but I can't disturb the fragile balance of the whole family. This kind of thing goes back generations in my extended family as well. My cousins are getting help and starting to stand their ground as adults. Overall, we just move on. Life goes on. I'm an adult. I'm no longer helpless. I just look at it like a war that ended, and now there's relative peace after the fighting just got old. Believe me, my sibling and I both dreamed of storming out and getting revenge when we became adults. Neither of us wanted that when the time came. We only wanted to move on. About 18 years of my life was hell. I have all the rest of it as mine to build up and out. My sibling and cousins sometimes talk about it, and that's all. We don't want to waste any more of our lives on these old problems or upset anyone else. Edit 2. I'm going to stop looking at comments now. I appreciate the kind words and motivation and hope you will do well in life. I'm an only child of two rather overprotective parents who more than anything have a very set view of the world and think that things have to go a certain way no matter what. Both of them have had their more annoying and embarrassing moments, but I was never outright punished for anything silly. The most memorable one though has to be from my last 2 years of high school. In Auckland, New Zealand, there is a water park called Wairua that has naturally heated pools. Because of the heat, there are also a lot of germs and bugs floating around in them, and my mum's cousin got bacterial meningitis from there and died. I think this happened in the 60s or 70s, and their health standards have since dramatically gone up. Anyway, due to this, my mum and grandparents were adamant that I was never going to go to Wairua. because we lived so close to it and because it was cheap and easy, relatively. There were always class trips there or camps at the end of the year etc. And whenever it was brought up as an idea I always had to tell my teacher in class that I wasn't allowed to go and why. Every year without fail this would happen. Every year my teacher would call my parents and tell them that I was lying in class, and every year my mum would tell the teacher that there was no way in hell the school was taking her daughter to Waywara. Once I was about 10 or 11, as you can imagine, this made me the weird kid who had never been to Waywara, and it wouldn't have been too bad, except it came up fairly often and usually meant a week or two of teasing and general annoyance that most kids try to avoid in school. By the time I was in high school I was used to it in the way you get used to anything that makes you different in high school that you know you'll never be able to change. Also I learned whenever we were talking about class trips to just speak to the teacher quietly instead of the whole class. Anyway, about halfway through my second to last year of high school I got the opportunity to go to Waywara with some friends. I knew I'd never be allowed to go, but as always I asked my parents anyway. My mum went off her rocker. It wasn't just a no or even a hell no. It was several hours of you will respect this family and what we will and will not allow etc. My mum wasn't really like that. When it came to doing something she didn't like, she usually explained it. But like me, she was probably at the end of her tether with requests to go to Waywara from over the years. I didn't really think anything of it and told my friends that I probably couldn't go. A couple hours later another friend asked me if I wanted to stay at her house for a week for some reason or another. I don't really remember why, but I said yes, especially after everything that was happening with my mum. I can't remember exactly how it all worked out, but I ended up going with the first group of friends and the younger sister of the friend I was staying with, and my parents were none the wiser. When I came home with a wet swimsuit I just told my mum we'd been to the local pool, even though it was the middle of winter, and nothing came of it. The water park was a total letdown. After 12 years of begging I would have rather gone to Wet n Wild on the Gold Coast, but I didn't really care because I'd been, and even if my parents found out they couldn't take the experience away from me. About a year later my best friend's dad was coming home from working overseas and was taking her brother and a friend each to Waywara. Again I asked my parents beforehand and my dad was the only one home and wasn't even listening to what I was asking and was like, yeah, sure, have fun. I think they were his exact words, and left before my mum even got home. It wasn't until the next morning as I was staying at a friend's place that my dad texted me and was like, did you really go to Waywara last night? And I was like, yep. My dad then told me that I was not allowed to tell my mother that he ever gave me permission to go, at which point I told him that every time I'd been I had asked to go beforehand. I was firmly told not to tell him any further as he wanted plausible deniability if this ever came up again. Nothing ever came of this until last year. I was 21, and that all happened when I was 16 over 17 and something happened, and Waywara came up in conversation with my parents. I, not even thinking it through, told my parents that I thought Waywara wasn't that bad, but Wet n Wild was better. The look on my mother's face was priceless. She is the sort of person who, when she's angry, will totally let you know, and she was stunned, completely silent. It took her about 10 minutes to process what exactly the implications of that sentence were, and spent about 6 hours trying to convince me to go to the hospital immediately, even though I hadn't lived in Auckland since I was 17 and hadn't been to Auckland since I was 18. Even my dad found it hilarious because, like me, he wasn't directly affected by the reason my mum hated Waywara. TL. Doctor, my mum wants me to go to the hospital because 6 or 7 years ago I went swimming. Admissions office. 5 years ago, I got a call at work from a person asking if there was any way for me to alter her application. I told her no, naturally, and that since it was a web form, she could do so herself. She asked if she would be getting any sort of automatic confirmation via email. I told her that naturally she would. She asked if it was possible to disable this. This was when my mind began asking me to sit up and pay attention, instead of just going along with the humdrum. Turns out, when she applied to college, all emails would go to her father, so he'd be able to keep track. She was calling from a payphone, because her father would go through hers regularly. She had restricted access to computers at home. She had one brother and one male cousin in school who were more or less chaperoning and or spying at all times. She had been forced to apply for stuff she really didn't want to study, and she'd been forced to apply to us because that meant she would be able to stay under his roof. She told me plain and simple that she wanted to make sure her application would get rejected and needed help finding out how to get admitted to somewhere further away. The further the better, really. She was desperate and was gonna use college, student loans and dorm life as an option to just make an escape and GTFO. I didn't dig too deeply into how bad the worm's nest really was, but she made it clear that she needed help. I did however look through the paperwork she had submitted for her application, and it did confirm things well enough, such as the email address not matching the name of the applicant. She didn't quite strike me as an Alphonse, and a letter of confirmation that her father was authorized to act as proxy in her place. In the end, an attachment to her application ended up misfiled, and due to some curious error, the database was never updated to reflect that her application was incomplete. I also pulled some strings and forwarded copies of her transcript to a colleague at some college in bumfuck nowhere that never managed to fill up their nursing program. A curious clerical error at their end meant that she had a database entry as an applicant, but no record of her application. This was however partially reconstructed well enough to be processed, and my colleague eventually made sure that her letter of admission was sent to us for some reason nobody could quite comprehend. And that's pretty much the story about how I ended up meeting some 18-year-old girl one evening as she was running away from home with pretty much only the clothes on her back and a small gym bag in order to hand her a letter of admission to a college at the other end of the country. My parents were always strict/overprotective, but shit really hit the fan when they figured out I was smoking weed and doing some other drugs in high school. Naturally they were extremely upset. I don't blame them for that. I was admittedly doing some stupid shit I shouldn't have been, though my usage in general was educated and fairly safe. I do still have a problem with the ways they handled this knowledge. There were many different punishments, outbursts, and misguided attempts to help me. The night they found out, they kept me up until the wee hours tearing apart my room in search of incriminating evidence. My mom would scream and cry on the floor in front of me. They changed the administrator account password on my computer and blocked all the evil websites like Reddit and Arrowit. I quickly remedied that by learning how to retrieve and change the password in single user mode. Thank you terrible MacBook security. I couldn't drive myself anywhere or see/contact any of my friends for several months except for during classes at school. Speaking of school, they called mine and had me put in lunchtime detention for the entirety of this period. I was miserable and isolated. They also read all of my text/Reddit comments/Facebook messages etc. And despite knowing every possible thing she could know, my mom still repeatedly accused me of doing stuff I never did. Things like having sex for drugs/money or being pregnant when the most I had done at that age was kiss. The real fun came when they decided I needed therapy. That in itself was fine. I had confessed to feeling very depressed for years in an attempt to explain myself. These therapy sessions had a catch though. They felt they needed to be involved in them so that they could listen directly to whatever I might say. There was one therapist they took me to who was actually sympathetic and kind to me, so they never took me to her again. Naturally they quit trying therapists altogether. Then they decided my difficult confessions of dealing with depression and all the things that came with it were lies, and that I was just a fuck up. I have more, but this is already too long. As a result of all this, my issues got much worse, and any relationship I had with them before was destroyed. It's been a slow and painful process rebuilding things. Years later, I'm still not sure I'll ever fully trust or be able to talk to them about my personal issues. A little late, and this wasn't me, it was my ex, who is my daughter's mom. We dated throughout high school. We'll call her Amy. When Amy was in the 7th grade, I started walking her home every once in a while. I was in 8th grade. I would simply walk with her 2 blocks to her house on the way to my destination. This lasted for a week, and then she started getting picked up after school. When she was in the 9th grade, her parents pulled her out of school to homeschool her because they felt that she had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Apparently the local church group, whose parents were all teachers and very active in the community, was the wrong crowd. She wasn't supposed to date or really have any friends except the few her parents had chosen for her. To see her, we had to sneak around, and this eventually turned into, hey, let's sneak out every night and climb into the other's bedroom window. Unsurprisingly, this led to her getting pregnant at 19 when she was still living with her parents and subject to their rules. She never finished high school. She ended up sleeping around with every guy out there and marrying a sex offender. She never sees our child. She is my inspiration to make sure my kids have the freedom they need to be themselves and a sense of autonomy. She clearly was stunted emotionally and mentally by her parents' abuse, and then she sought out the most controlling, violent husband she could find, and now lives in his home, rarely leaving, with 3 daughters, who are children of a violent sex offender who has been in jail for abuse several times. Give your kids some freedom, people. It is your business where they are and what they are up to, but that involvement should start to lessen year by year, starting at age 12. By the time they are 16, you should be able to trust your child within reason to be pretty much autonomous as long as they are meeting their obligations. You don't give them a 9 PM bedtime, but you pay attention, and if they seem tired, you make them to go bed at 9 PM for a few days to catch up on sleep. You don't go through their phones, but you do teach them that everything they put into writing is permanent and to properly represent themselves. You don't keep them in the dark about sex or forbid it. You make sure they understand the possible consequences, encourage them to wait until they are ready, and teach them to be safe. Your goal as a parent is to put yourself out of a job. In other words, get them to the point that they don't need a parent. That will never happen if you're making all their decisions or refusing to let them be free and be themselves. I'm late to the game, but I've got something to finally get off my chest. I'm by no means proud of this, and it affected my life profoundly. My mother is incredibly controlling, would always make sure I wasn't doing anything Christian like. She didn't care about my grades so much, just controlling what I did, watched, or read, etc. When I was 15, my mom and I were living with my aunt, since my parents had just divorced. I stole my aunt's credit card and bought a flashlight. One day she went through my belongings as she normally would and found it. I came home from school and noticed it was gone, and she didn't confront me initially. A few days passed, and she furiously yelled at me and said we were leaving their house. She told me how disgusting I was and how embarrassed she was of me. We moved within that week 2 states away with nowhere to go. We lived from shitty motel to the next. I had to share a bed with her because we didn't have money and she didn't have a job. I was never allowed to take a shower longer than 10 minutes or she would bang on the door and yelled at me to stop playing with your jingle bells. Even though I was never masturbating in the shower, she would call me gross and say I was just like my father. I eventually couldn't take being ridiculed all the time and living in shitty motels. One day I tried on her lipstick and makeup and she found out, which made her very angry. She kept calling me nasty and said something was very wrong with me. Honestly, I was a weird ass kid and it was a strange phase for me. I eventually locked myself in that motel bathroom and tried to commit suicide with a razor blade. I was so ashamed of myself and embarrassed that I didn't want to live anymore. In the hospital they helped us get a place to live, and we lived together in a women's shelter for a year. I still had to share a bed with her again in a room with 3 other people. It was one of the lowest points in my life, all because I bought a flashlight. I lost my home, privacy, and self-worth for almost 2 years. I knew that the reason we lived in the women's shelter and had no home was my fault for being a pervert. It made it hard for me to this day to ever share my kinks with my partners. I haven't been able to tell this story to anyone ever until this year because of how horrible I felt about the whole thing. I still like sex toys a lot, but I don't ever share the fact that I own them with my partners. I feel embarrassed about them and often go through phases of throwing them away because of how much shame they give me. My current GF knows I have them, but I won't show them to her. TL. Doctor, mom found my flashlight and it made us homeless. So this thread is full of insane helicopter parents. Mine weren't that bad, just high expectation Asian parents. I was the kid who scored tops on all papers and ranked 1 in the year. Know what I paid for that? No TV whatsoever. It's just garbage, and to be fair, even as a kid I knew things like Voltron and Captain Power were just fantasies. Also, could hang around with other kids, but curfew in the evening. That's fair. It's not like you can play or ride your bike in the dark, am I right? Still, that did mean I basically hung around nearby the house, so I didn't really get to hang out with the other kids at malls or parks, or wherever kids hang out to interact. See, that's what I lost out on. Peer interaction. My parents weren't terrible people like you read in these other posts, they were just too fixated on what I should accomplish. Remember those meme pics about a Chinese guy wearing surgical garb holding his newborn infant son, with the caption, "Son, you're going to be a doctor?" Yeah. All work and barely stimulating play, you can only amuse yourself so much, turned me from an average little boy into a bookish nerd and a ton of missed social cues. By the time teams rolled in, I was that guy in the corner nobody talked to because I didn't have a fucking clue what to talk about with the other kids. TV. I didn't get to watch it, remember? Over time the gap just widened, and I basically said fuck it, and just did my own thing. Now nearly 40 and the folks wonder why I never got around to dating. You wanted me to hit the books, so I did. We are paying you to go to college to study, not to pick up girls. Fine, whatever. Now suddenly when I start working I'm magically supposed to catch up on all the years I blew out on mingling with my peers? Yeah, that's not going to happen. I found my people, and they're internet shitposters. Thanks mom and dad. The ironic thing is, people like me have adapted to the lack of interaction. You could lock me in a library alone by myself, and I would be fine, while regular people would probably start going crazy. I was once deployed on a rural posting where for 3 years, mid-1990s, I basically lived in a house myself out in the country, and the only human interaction was the bi-weekly grocery runs to the supermarket in the town about half an hour's drive through lonely plantation roads and forested areas. HQ thought there were 2 other guys there, they were actually at the town. I only emailed them, I never actually met them. Had a lot of free time for gaming and reading, I actually had fun. But I can imagine it would be some kind of nightmare scenario for most people. For me that time was the best job ever, until HQ recalled me after the 3 years, and promoted me into a desk job in the city. Bleh. My story is going to diverge quite a bit from a lot here for a simple reason. I inherited my mother's schizophrenia. My mother was an alcoholic psycho with all kinds of delusions, and my father was largely absent when I was young, Navy brat. When I was very young I remember her being possessed by an Indian chief and then punching me a few times while pulling my hair. She sometimes had me kneel down so my mentally handicapped younger brother could beat me. Stopping him was a beating. She sat me down in a packing tape pentagram with house candles and transferred power to me so I could be a warlock. She thought she was a witch. Tons of stories like that. The change happened when I had a nervous breakdown at 14. I started developing my own delusions and felt hunted by what I refer to as shadow men. My mother lost all control. I got big rage with my newfound psychosis and began systematically destroying beloved things of my mother's as revenge. I regularly attacked my brother for revenge. I was too young to understand the damage I was piling onto him. I ran away constantly, made it harder to track me by destroying all my photos, early 90s, and got in with the wrong people. Hard drugs, lots of sex, fights, and time in juvie. Unlike a lot of people here I flipped out bad. Luckily for me, my schizophrenia is milder, and I was able to slowly wrestle control of myself back. I calmed down, I apologized to my father and brother as best one could. I became what I think is a good person. One makes mistakes, but one endeavors for the ideal. My mother died horribly a decade ago, and I wish I could tell you that I felt something, but I didn't even take a day off work. I pretended some sadness for my father's sake, though I think he was secretly relieved. No one misses her, but my poor brother who never went through what I did. To this day, I don't know why I was the one to be abused. I no longer care. I'm now father to a daughter, and though I'm scared I'll end up like my mother, my little girl is smart, social, and happy. I keep a very tight rein on my thoughts and actions. My paranoia only really activates when I'm alone for long periods of time, days. The only hallucinations I hear now is an occasional whisper of my name from the darkness, and that's easy enough to ignore. Let this be a warning to potential helicopter parents reading through this. You could get a docile person for the duration that will deal with what you do to them as an adult. Or you could unleash a